Hi, welcome to an episode of Review Rewind. Before Friday's finale, the first of three parts of a grand finale of the Fast and Furious franchise, starting with Fast 10 going through Fast a Billion. So, at the beginning of the Fast and the Furious, Brian goes to visit Mia, who he falls madly in love with, to order a nasty tuna sandwich that apparently nobody but Brian likes. Maybe it was his way of saying, baby, I'll eat your bad cooking if you make me your good cooking eventually. But after Dom's crew sees that Brian's there, Vince, one of Dom's men, doesn't seem to like Brian too much. He'd been crushing on Mia for years and took it personally that Brian decided to show up. So the two get in a fight and Brian nearly loses his job at Harry's pushing car parts. Later that night, Brian goes into his first street race as an undercover cop against Dom. He loses the race, although very slightly at the end, a point which is actually a big theme of the franchise. Brian smiles and jokes around about how he almost beats Dom despite his car smoking more than Snoop Dogg on April 20th, and Dom ends up hitting him with a speech about how a win is a win. Brian still claims that he almost had him. The cops come and everybody scatters. The cops end up chasing down Toretto, even calling him over their microphone by his last name. Later on, however, after Brian saves Dominic, we don't hear anything or any sort of noise from the police that they're after Toretto despite knowing his last name and wanting to take him to jail. So Brian earns a place in the family quickly as he gains Dom's trust by saving him from the cops. He goes over to Dom's place, gets ready to leave before Dom invites him in for a drink, tells him, quite cheekily, that he can have any drink he wants as long as it's a Corona. Quite a staple of this franchise and their product placement. They sure do love a good beer. I mean, hey, who can't enjoy a good Corona? On his way upstairs with Letty to extend the Fast and Furious family, he decides to let Brian know that he still owes him a 10-second car. So the next day, he delivers to him a project car where the engine is the only thing that is salvageable. And they joke around that the car could make it across the finish line in 10 minutes and it's not quite a 10-second car and they need to put quite a bit of work in on it. Dominic's car guy, Jesse, starts to get to work taking the car apart piece by piece only to rebuild it back together. Dom lets Brian know as they're getting started on the project car that he wants to get the car up and racing again in order to make money off of Brian as a racer. Something that's a bit confusing considering after the race and he beats Brian, the whole crowd is gathered around and he lets Brian know how he basically drove like a grandma and is an extremely inexperienced driver. So how exactly did he plan on making money off of Brian as a racer if Brian barely made it to the finish line without his car falling apart? The world may never know. So as the car gets put together and the timeline of Brian busting who the main culprit seems to be, Dom, gets closer and closer, the police start to put more of a tight grip on O'Connor. They let him know that he has less than 36 hours to bring in Toretto. He decides to speed up the process for himself. He lets Dom know over a lunch together that he wants in on any business deals that Dom has and that there's no way he can possibly be making that much money off of just an honest day's work. Dom lets him in on a little bit of what the crew is doing. At Race Wars, Johnny Tran, the film's main antagonist, races Jesse for pink slips. He easily beats Jesse, who was a little bit cocky going into the race, but his dad was getting out of jail pretty soon, and he decided he wanted to get him a new car to go right alongside him. Unfortunately, that clearly didn't work out and the plan blew up in his face and he owed Johnny Tran the car. Johnny, after he wins the race, sees Jesse racing off. After Johnny Tran tells Dom to go fetch his car, Dom, tongue-in-cheek, tells him that he just went to the car wash, there's nothing to worry about. So as the night progresses and the crew starts yelling at each other while Brian is off to the side, Brian goes up to Mia and asks her what's wrong. Brian tells her that he doesn't normally see her in tears as she's walking away from the crew. Such a romantic to notice such a detail. But hey, a cop on a timeline is pretty desperate. So he reveals to her that he's a cop after he's worried about Dom and the crew deciding to rob a truck. This decision by Dom and the rest of the crew quickly blew up in their faces as Letty's car topples over, although she is nearly invincible by the stakes of this franchise in which characters are untouchable versus aren't. And Vince unfortunately gets his arm caught before Brian saves the day with Mia alongside him. I'm sure he wasn't too happy seeing Mia there, but you know, when your arm's getting kind of pulled and you're seeing the future that could be 127 hours starring James Franco as you starts to happen, he'll take the save the day moment from Brian when he can. So Brian, after he saves Vince, and the crew abandons the robbery, has to call down a helicopter, revealing his identity to Dom, who looks like a grizzly bear in the wilderness at this point, getting ready to topple over his prey. Something tells me it didn't take a lot of acting from the late great Paul Walker to act fearful of Dom in that particular moment. So after they escape, Brian ends up going back to Dom's place to either make a final arrest or decide once and for all that he truly respects him. But before it gets to that point, Jesse, who had lost the pink slip to his car to Johnny Tran, ends up being hunted down by a couple of Johnny's men and shot. So to retaliate, Dom and Brian both chase down Johnny's men, who were two people, I believe, both on motorcycles. Not the most climactic final battle of all time, but after they end up getting their so-called revenge, the two race through the train tracks where Dom, possibly the most strong fictional character of all time, takes a train head-on and ends up surviving it. The first of many nearly life or death experience for a normal human that isn't quite Vin Diesel. But don't worry, he survives it, and in true brotherhood fashion and betrayal of the badge and everything it stands for, as The Rock would state later on, Dom ends up getting the keys handed over to him. Brian had gained respect for Dom throughout this movie. Was it because of Mia and the fact that he was just head over heels for her, or did he actually respect Dom as a man? Well, if you've watched the movie, clearly he respects Dom as a man, although the whole plot point of Dom having beaten somebody half to death with a socket wrench, and the guy now only works as a janitor, must just went whoosh right over Brian's head, or else he somewhat understood. Either way, I don't think most cops would react this way, whether or not Mia was or wasn't part of the discussion. Regardless, Dom, after gaining the mad respect of Brian, gets the keys to his 10-second car, escapes, and rides off into the sunset. Brian, on the other hand, is left there to deal with the aftermath and repercussions of his actions. Cue the after-credit sequence. Going back, this movie really is kind of a head-scratcher as to if it's a good movie. It's really not necessarily a bad movie because of its entertainment value, although the script was almost a complete ripoff of Point Break, starring Keanu Reeves and Patrick Swayze. You can take it down to the point where instead of it being surfers, there's racers, but you have the new kid on the block who's also the pretty boy, which in Point Break is Keanu Reeves, and in this one it's Paul Walker. Both fall head over heels for a woman that isn't quite what they've met before. So Keanu Reeves, Johnny Utah, visits Tyler every day to get shrimp and fries from her, while Brian O'Connor ends up ordering tuna from Mia every day. They weren't trying to disguise the fact that this movie was basically a pure ripoff, and just, with that being said, this is overall a good movie. There is actually some serious heart to these movies. Vin Diesel is hardly an Oscar-worthy actor. He knows his niche, he knows his audience, knows it very well to the point where he's now planning a 13th Fast and Furious movie. I'll continue on with Too Fast, Too Furious, but for now, let me know your thoughts on this one in the comments below.